Hello and welcome back to another episode of ParaGhoul Paranormal, where we dive into the shadows and into the dark to see what lies beneath. I'm your host, KD Kulpa, and I love bringing life to the bumps in the night, whether through writing fiction, like in my upcoming supernatural horror novel, which will be released this September here in Regina if you're interested, or even through historical and paranormal research, or through conducting interviews with people that are interested in the paranormal and into mysteries and that have stories about these things. Now, today we're going to be talking about actually an urban legend. I did some research into kind of what urban legends there are in Canada's history, and tonight we're going to be talking about one of them, and that is the Wendigo. Funny enough, the entire reason why I started researching the Wendigo in the beginning was not because of the actual creature itself. I knew it was part of some horror movies. I knew I've seen it in horror television shows, but I just thought of it like as a creature, like a lot of them are, the vampires and the werewolves. I didn't really think about it in the context of this is specifically a North American legend. So when I actually first started researching urban legends here in Canada, I was surprised to find that supposedly there was one even close to home, which was that in Fort Kent, Alberta, that there was a Wendigo. And this was really took me by surprise because I actually lived in, Alberta in St. Paul, which is really close to Fort Kent. Now, it was a few years ago. I think it was 2006 or something, but I still had never heard of a Wendigo actually being, something that supposedly walked Canadian soil. So that was the whole reason why I went down the rabbit hole of learning about Wendigos and really getting into the history of Wendigos in Canada. And I found some interesting facts as well as some interesting stories. So that is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So to start, let's dig into, the history. Like, where did the Wendigo come from? What folklore did it originate in? Let's start there. So the Wendigo, not surprising, has many spellings, many names. It all kind of depends on which part of its history that you talk to or which, indigenous group it came from. But overall, the Wendigo is considered a mythological creature or spirit that can possess a human and turn them into this ravenous kind of half-beast creature. Now, it is said to have originated from Algonquian folklore along the coast of both Canada and the United States. So when a human is overtaken by this creature, the key characteristics is this unbelievable hunger that you just cannot satisfy. And it's particularly for human flesh. So, cannibalism and an urge to murder others. So in other words, you are turned into a cannibal. That is what this creature supposedly does. As you can likely figure out, that's probably why it's such a great concept for horror novels, horror books, horror TV shows, horror movies, because cannibalism is kind of a theme that you tend to find in that space. And I even remember the Wendigo being featured on, the Supernatural TV show. When the Winchesters had to chase down and hunt down a Wendigo to save the people that it had taken. So in that particular episode, I remember that I don't think you ever actually saw what the Wendigo looked like, but you knew that it could mimic voices, it could lure you towards its cave where it would then trap you and eventually eat you. So that was a slightly different twist of the Wendigo story, I guess you could call it, which I thought was interesting because it seems that everyone has kind of their own take on what the Wendigo is, but it really did all come from North American indigenous cultures. So, because of that, of course, there are many names, many different spellings. I'm not going to try to pronounce them, but some of them are Wendigo, Wetiko, I'm assuming is how you say that. The Ojibwe called it the Wendigo, which translates to winter cannibal monster. Other translations claim it may mean owl in other cultures. So not only were there many names for this supposed creature, but also a lot of different versions of, what it actually looked like. So no wonder Hollywood had so much fun creating this creature, because there was no, one specific take on it. It was really all over the map. Some say it's a giant starving creature that can possess humans during cold winter months and send them on a rampage of murder and cannibalism. If you ever actually looked up on, Google or your search engine what a Wendigo supposedly looks like, you'll get a range of different things. Some of them have giant antlers on top of their head. Some of them are very humanoid. If you go by the owl version, would the owl have antlers? I'm not really sure. It doesn't really make sense to me, but it made me think of, if you're a World of Warcraft player like I am, which is an online massive multiplayer game, then you might think of Wildkin, which is a character in the game, which is an owl with antlers, but they're bigger, they're fatter, so they aren't quite the same. So, no wonder it's hungry. It's because it's starving, it's skinny, it's skin and bone, and apparently it also has the odor of rotting flesh and decay. However, if you go back to the original legends, some of them just said it was a human-like creature that was a human size. So I don't know where in its history it changed shape or became more like an owl or became more like a yeti kind of thing, or where it grew antlers, but that's just the way that it has evolved over time. What I found really interesting about the Wendigo folklore was that it was actually really specific to times of famine and hunger, particularly in the middle of winter months within North America. When finding food is really difficult. So no wonder that starving would be something that would be top of mind at that, back in the day in winter months. Apparently there was even a ceremonial dance in some traditions that could be performed during these times of famine to try and remind the community to really promote cooperation and moderation. And kind of the Wendigo legend was more to warn against greed and gluttony, so that, as an individual person, you're not going against the community. And this legend actually was prior to the migration of Europeans into North America. So it was primarily a story, passed down orally between generations before the Europeans came. There was even some articles that I read that claimed it could have been a cautionary tale to prevent children from wandering off, because you wouldn't want your kids, or really anyone, wandering alone in the winter months in North America. There's not only could you get lost and freeze, but there are other things out there that are also starving that might not care if you are human and it is a bear or whatever. So it could be used as a warning in that way as well. So it's not surprising that this particular creature is so popular in horror movies, TV shows, novels, all of those things, because it has so many potential. It has so many different variations, so you could really do anything with it. Apparently, it was also in Stephen King's book, Pet Sematary. Although, even though I've read it, I don't remember the Wendigo being in it, but and they've also been in Hannibal TV series, which is not surprising considering that's all about cannibalism. Marvel Comics, the list goes on and on. So now this is where I want to kind of dive into the actual story of Fort Kent, Alberta, because that part made me actually laugh out loud, if I'm being entirely honest. As soon as I started digging into the story, I realized that something wasn't quite adding up. And as I'm sure any of you that follow paranormal stories, or, just the unknown stories in general, whether it's paranormal, UFOs, any of these kind of mysteries, you really need to do your research before you believe them, because you just never know what you're getting. And with the Fort Kent, Alberta story, I was able to quickly track down why I had never heard of this before. But first, let's go into the story about what exactly this is. So supposedly the story starts that a wave of rats infesting the small town of Fort Kent back in the late 1920s, was really causing a lot of havoc on the town. Many people had become sick, prompting a doctor from England named Thomas Burton to work hard to try and save as many of the small town villagers small townspeople, I should say, as possible. Unfortunately, many were still lost to the disease, of course, and the following winter was extremely harsh, like Canadian winters in the 1920s would be. I mean, realistically, they still are, but at least we have better homes to deal with them, right? However, the rats somehow thrived through the winter, which I would find surprising, and continued to grow in numbers into the spring. That's when the livestock that had survived the winter started being found partially eaten, supposedly attacked by a large bear-like creature that hungers for living flesh. The doctor, who is still fighting the smallpox infestation in the town, is suddenly overtaken by grief because his wife succumbs to the disease and eventually dies. In his grief and frustration with being unable to save people from the disease, Thomas Burton locks up his house and refuses to see any patients from the town. What the townspeople don't know is that during this time, he even makes a shrine for his wife's body, which is when he snaps. Suddenly, he starts to kill transients at first, but slowly starts to kill more and more people in town, making the population suddenly change from 150 to only 11 survivors before Burton is caught, and is one of the first people hung in town and is considered to have been overtaken by a Wendigo. Now, as I'm sure if you are like me and you're from Saskatchewan, or maybe you've lived in Alberta or you're from Alberta, a massive massacre like this in the 1920s would have still been, fairly big news to us growing up, especially for Western Canada, especially for Saskatchewan and Alberta, I would think. So the fact that I had never heard about this, probably it's not surprising what I found out. So while researching, as I said, quickly figured out this is actually a mockumentary that took an unexpected turn. So someone by the name of Leslie Shivers had visited Fort Kent with his friend, and he had decided that he was going to make up this massacre to create a horror movie, which I love the idea. I think it's a fantastic idea. However, in the end, he unfortunately ran out of money, and you can read more about his attempts, to make it into a movie and to make it into a mockumentary and to make it into a story. There's a whole bunch of stuff that he talks about on his website, and you can find, I think there's even a Facebook page about it. So if you want to look into it, you can find more information. However, the amazing thing about this, and as a author myself, I just find this fascinating because Creepy Canada actually got a hold of him because they wanted to run his story as if it was a true story, like a true legend. And it did actually go out in season 2, which would have come out in late 2003. So in context to when I was living close to Fort Kent, this would have been only 3 years before. So no wonder I had never heard of it. It was still fairly new, and it was still not, probably wasn't massively known yet that Creepy Canada had done this episode. So the real story is probably your typical small town story, that it was big at one time and slowly diminished in population because everyone moved to cities or moved to different, provinces or whatever. There was no massive massacre. There was no crazy Wendigo on the loose in Fort Kent. And especially when you're thinking about Wendigos are expected to come out in winter, so why would it suddenly show up in spring and early summer? But you know what? I think it was hilarious. I honestly did laugh out loud when I found out what the actual start of this Fort Kent story was. And I think that's fantastic for Leslie to get so much publicity from a story or from like a movie he was trying to make. I hope he's able to make something out of it. Again, as I said at the beginning, you know, this kind of thing with paranormal and supernatural or anything in the unknown, you're gonna find hoaxes, you're gonna find fakes. And not to say that Leslie had intended to make a hoax, it just kind of went beyond probably what he was expecting to happen, but it's gonna happen. So that's another reason why I got into kind of paranormal research, is because I like digging into learning, you know, what is actually a mystery versus what has been made up. You know, is there logical stories behind some of these legends and some of these things? So I hope you don't mind digging into these with me, because that is what I love to do. So hopefully you don't mind searching out the hoaxes and things, as well as finding the actual legitimate mysteries and unsolved things that, you know, people can't explain. However, even saying all of that about the Fort Kent story, I still feel, you know, really glad that I went down this rabbit hole with the Wendigos, because I didn't realize the history, and especially the North American indigenous history that is really behind this. And especially since I, you know, live in Saskatchewan, I didn't know that this was even a actual legend in our history here. So I'm really glad I went into it. And if you look into the progression of the Wendigo legend, it's still kind of, it's changed quite a bit, obviously, because the times have changed. But it started with those oral stories. And, you know, if you read there's different versions. So there are even some versions where the Wendigo isn't actually fully evil and out to get everybody. It's instead looking to punish those that were individuals in a community that were, you know, going against what the community needed. So they were being selfish, they were being greedy, they were being gluttonous, and that was the ones that the Wendigo supposedly would attack. But if you went and you were good in the community and you know, did things in moderation and you helped each other, the Wendigo might actually reward you. So that was kind of even another story about it. But as the Europeans moved into North America, they started to take notes of the Wendigo as being more of a mental illness. And they really targeted the North American indigenous groups. Eventually, they started to even refer it as the Wendigo psychosis in the early 20th century. The claim then was that those that were said to be possessed by the Wendigo were simply suffering a mental condition causing delusions, anxiety, and depression during times of famine and hardship. And you can even find a definition on the American Psychological Association website to this day that says the Wendigo psychosis is a severe culture-bound syndrome occurring among northern Algonquin Indians living in Canada and the northeastern United States. This is word for word, by the way. The syndrome is characterized by delusions of becoming possessed by a flesh-eating monster, the Wendigo, and is manifested in symptoms including depression, violence, and a compulsive desire for human flesh, and sometimes actual cannibalism. So that is the word-for-word definition on their website. Of course, there are a couple cases in Canadian history of, you know, people being arrested related to Wendigo occurrences. One of the more famous ones is in Alberta and is that of a trapper named Swift Runner. Now, what I could find about this particular case is that during the winter of 1878, so a long time ago, Swift Runner and his family were starving, eventually leading to the death of his oldest son. Now, apparently, even though he was near a trading port where he could get food and, you know, he could solve the starving problem, supposedly, instead he butchered and killed his remaining family members and ate them. In this case, the RCMP determined that this wasn't a case of starvation leading to cannibalism, but instead was just the case of Wendigo psychosis, which Swift Runner eventually admitted to. However, there has been some pushback about the whole Wendigo psychosis being made up by anthropologists, which when I read the, you know, American psychologist's definition of it, I would agree that there should be pushback, but That's my personal opinion. Anyway, I don't know that it's actually a condition. But it has been said that Swift Runner was the first official execution within Alberta, and it was related to this Wendigo psychosis, so that's why I had to bring it up. Another famous case in Canadian history regarding Wendigo psychosis has to do with Jack Fiddler, who was a medicine man known for his ability to defeat Wendigos. However, in 1907, the Canadian authorities decided they didn't believe his claims that he and his brother were going around killing Wendigos, and instead arrested him for murdering people. Another author claimed that the Wendigo legend may have come during those times because of the need for cannibalism for survival. So, they called it Wendigo psychosis or called it being possessed by a Wendigo to make themselves feel better, about going around and being a cannibal, I suppose. But I don't know if I really go with that either. There's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of different opinions on this particular legend that I didn't realize I was going to follow down the rabbit hole of, but that is just what it is. The latest spin on the Wendigo legend, of course, is now changing even more, which they're now referring to cannibalism in, this Hollywood sense that we're talking about, to instead looking at cannibalism in the economy sense. So, the rise of capitalism and that kind of thing. And if you want to look into this one, I did find this kind of interesting, an interesting spin on it. So it's Winona LaDuke has been using the term Wendigo economy, which is a version of our economy that is against the natural cycles of the earth, leading to the destruction of our natural resources and, interrupting cycles, all to develop wealth for the economy. So as someone that is always looking for ways to reduce my impact on the environment, her speeches were interesting to listen to, or at least it's an interesting take and an interesting spin on the Wendigo legend. And I really think it does play into that, the oral tradition of using the Wendigo as a warning against something, a warning against going against community, a warning against going against environment in this case. So I actually think it's kind of an interesting way to spin the Wendigo legend. So based on all of these things that I've read and researched, I guess what is my opinion and thoughts on this particular legend or topic? In all honesty, I don't think that there was ever really a creature. So I don't think it's a legend in that sense of there's actually a creature out doing this. I agree with those that speculate it was likely more just folklore, just an oral tradition warning individuals during times of famine and harsh winters in North America, which if you're living in Regina like me, that winter can get really harsh. And just reminding them to work together, to stay together, to not go off into the woods alone in the middle of winter, but also to not succumb to the feelings of greed, anger, and hatred. I think it's a message that we should even be able to get behind today, because we get those things and we aren't living, in much harder conditions. We have houses with heat. We have houses with running water all throughout the winter. So we don't have that kind of hardship like they did back then. But I think it's still a good message. Personally, I feel like the Wendigo isn't, something possessing people. I don't know that it was really about cannibalism. Maybe there was some instances, but I'm sure they're rare. I agree with the authors that went more on the side of it was a warning tale against greed and gluttony and going against community. That's just what it sounds like to me. Maybe there were some psychiatric conditions periodically during harsh times of famine and isolation where this kind of stuff would have come up. But given that oral traditions and stories tend to be told as warnings from harsh realities, I'm guessing that's probably how it all started. And it just got spun out by the Europeans coming, and then people nowadays in Hollywood and, people just spinning it out of control. Like many things. Because I can't imagine, the conditions that they would have to have lived in back then during winter in our province alone, without insulation in their houses, without, food in a grocery store down the street, which you could drive your car to. It would be very difficult mentally, emotionally, and physically to be going through that every single year. So it doesn't surprise me that North American Indigenous cultures would have stories to warn against, going against community, going against what was good for the whole of, the area that you're living in. So although I don't believe in the Wendigo itself or in the possession stories or in any of that, I do believe that winters in Canada can be very harsh. So I can only imagine what you had to try and help people survive at that time. And this story probably was a great story to tell around the campfire, to remind your community to stay together, to collaborate, and to help each other during those harsh times, and to prevent paranoia and anger. Not to mention, it makes for a great scary story around the fire. Like, can you imagine sitting in a campground or with your friends or going to, one of those camps, sitting around the fire and like, okay, let's all just tell scary stories. And someone told you the story of a Wendigo, like lurking the woods behind you. It would have been terrifying. I think it's a fantastic story. Sorry for the rabbit hole that I fell down today. But I hope you liked this episode. Thank you for tuning in and embarking on this journey with me into the Wendigo history. In the next episode, we'll actually be diving into another personal experience of mine. We'll be talking about a Regina location that I have toured and the story behind the haunting. So let me ask you, have you had a pint with James yet? Remember, if you want to know about upcoming episodes or to learn where to catch recordings, you can find me on most of the social media platforms. Remember, it's the letter K, the letter D, and then KULPA. I'm on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, so make sure you reach out and connect with me there. And you can also let me know what is your favorite episode or what do you hope to hear in future episodes. Stay tuned for our upcoming stories and guest interviews where we'll uncover more secrets, unravel more mysteries, and delve deeper into the shadows. Until then, remember to keep your flashlight handy and digital recorders ready. This is Katie Kulpa, signing off. Until next time, my ghouls.